Hello my fellow citizens of the United Kingdom. My name is Glenn Floyd and I'm calling from Australia to let you know that you are embarking upon one of the most monumental historical events since the Second World War. You are now going to examine the outputs of the Chilcot inquiry, which reports upon Anthony Charles Lyndon Blair's war crimes in Iraq. It's significant because one thing that the majority of world citizens do not know is that 6 months before the attack on Iraq on the 20th of March 2003, 6 months before that, the nation of Iraq surrendered. Foreign Minister Naji Sabri of Iraq fully surrendered its complete military armaments and full sovereignty and territory to the United Nations on the 16th of September 2002, as I say, 6 months before the attack. Now, I want you to contrast that. That's a point in history which remains with us with a most sinister overtone. The comparison is on the 2nd of September 1945 on board the decks of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur, representing the Allied forces, signed a full honourable treaty with the nation of Japan, a full surrender of full military armaments and sovereignty on board the decks of the Missouri, as I say, and he signed that with Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, who laid down Japan's sovereignty, armaments and territories in full surrender. The contrast is, when the Japanese surrendered in Tokyo Bay, not one bomb was dropped. Respect was given to Japan, the nation fully surrendered, nobody was killed. There were no more atom bombs dropped with horrific consequences. You've got to contrast that with what happened on the 20th of March 2003, where 6 months after Foreign Minister Naji Sabri made full surrender to the United Nations, Anthony Charles Lyndon Blair, John Winston Howard and George Walker Bush attacked Iraq after they surrendered. This has never happened in modern warfare or extremely rare in history. It is the most despicable act of recreant, craven cowardice that can possibly occur, and particularly in world historical events. On that horrific night and thereafter, in 2003, the coalition of the Chilling rained down 1,700 ferocious air attacks with 504 lethal cruise missiles containing deadly depleted uranium. And the aftermath of that and the massive birth defects that have occurred ever since are horrific. So what you're facing now is Anthony Charles Lyndon Blair attacking a nation after it fully surrendered. And as I said before, world citizens are completely unaware. I have made a brief of evidence to the United Nations with a jus in bello case against John Winston Howard for war crimes in Iraq. And I think it's time for the British people to also undertake the same jus in bello brief of evidence against Anthony Charles Lyndon Blair. The reason is, like many commentators that are making remarks about what will happen to Blair, the Chilcot inquiry will merely produce its finding tomorrow, and it cannot take any action. All it can do is refer that report to Parliament. It's actually up to your Parliament to take the action. So it is in the hands of you United Kingdom citizens to take the action and force your Parliament to take the action on your behalf against Anthony Charles Lyndon Blair, the war criminal. Now, under the Rome Statute, which examines war crimes and crimes against humanity, the Rome Statute does not allow any leader of a country to be examined for starting a war. That doctrine in law is called the jus ad bellum doctrine. It means, what were the reasons, was there justice for the commencement of the war? And the Rome Statute has no jurisdiction to examine who started a war. But the Rome Statute does have jurisdiction to examine the severity of actions in the war. Now, I have put together a brief of evidence against John Winston Howard for war crimes under the jus in bello doctrine. Now, stated simply, that means justice in battle, jus in bello. And it means that if you undertake conflict, at no time can you take an act of conflict which is extremely disproportionate to the expected military advantage. And the jus in bello means that if your action is completely disproportionate or out of proportion to the risks against you with the military theatre or attack being considered, the way you respond in your attack can be examined by the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The case I've put forward is this. If Iraq made a full written military surrender of armaments and sovereignty 6 months before the war on the 16th of September 2002, from that point onwards, WMD meant nothing. Up until that particular date, 16th September 2002, weapons of mass destruction were a potential risk. But on that date, Iraq's Foreign Minister Najib Sabri made a full written formal military and sovereignty and territorial surrender of Iraq's nation to the United Nations, which meant from the 16th September 2002, even if Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, it surrendered. The nation surrendered. A comparison might be made that in the Second World War, on the decks of the Missouri, the Japanese surrendered, and they still had massive stockpiles of weapons and aircraft and submarines and ships all over the world ready for attack. But they surrendered. And nobody in Japan, or against the Japanese forces, nobody was killed after that date, because surrender means surrender. But with the rogue, butchering, ghoulish, killing war criminals, Anthony Charles Lyndon Blair, John Winston Howard and George Walker Bush, these war criminals undertook a war after a surrender. This is unheard of in civilized history. So the jus in bello case I put forward simply says justice in battle. Now, I need to explain that justice in battle has a broad connotation. It means, for example, a standard case to consider is if there was a schoolhouse containing 1,000 children and it was only secured by maybe 5 or 6 armed guards, it is a disproportionate attack to bomb that schoolhouse where you risk the death and lives of all those children. So that would be a jus in bello, which means justice in battle. There has to be justice in battle. That would be an attack that would be unjust and a violation of the jus in bello doctrine, because it is unconscionable to bomb a schoolhouse with 1,000 children only protected by a few guards. That's where my jus in bello precedent brief of evidence rests. It's been accepted by the International Criminal Court as brief number 425 of 2007. It's still live, and I'm waiting for further evidence from the Chilcot inquiry to make additional briefs to send it to the ICC when the evidence comes out of Chilcot. But the point I'm trying to make is the jus in bello doctrine simply says you cannot undertake disproportionate acts of violence in war. And the very fact that Anthony Charles Lyndon Blair, John Winston Howard and George Walker Bush undertook to attack Iraq after they had surrendered their full sovereignty, their full armaments and their territory. It was an unconscionable act of war, which is a violation of the jus in bello doctrine precedent. As I was saying before, the weapons of mass destruction were highly material until the 16th of September 2002, when Iraq surrendered its full sovereignty, territory and armaments. From that day forward, there was no risk from WMD. Even if Iraq had WMD, from surrender forward, there is no risk. So Anthony Charles Lyndon Blair has been able to mislead the world press and world commentators in continually bleating on about he believed there were weapons. It did not matter at law whether there were weapons or not. The fact that Iraq surrendered 6 months before the war meant that there was an obligation not to attack and bomb, because the fact of the weapons existing or not, or the risk, would have been determined by Iraq allowing the full teams to come in and inspect anywhere which it offered. So for Anthony Charles Lyndon Blair, John Winston Howard and George Walker Bush to attack a country after it's surrendered marks them as the greatest recreant craven cowards in history. Where does all this lead to? Okay, when Chilcot hands down its inquiry, it can merely state that Anthony Charles Lyndon Blair acted this way or that way. It can do nothing more than refer it to Parliament for action. Chilcot cannot take action. It may not even be able to recommend action. Nonetheless, it reports to Parliament. Now, there have been statements from various people in Britain saying impeachment might be an answer. Irrelevant. Even if that takes place, and it'd be convoluted if it did, what you're dealing with is a subversion of Parliament. The very fact that Chilcot was constituted means Anthony Charles Lyndon Blair undertook a subversion of Parliament. That's why the inquiry took place. Now, when it gives its result, that is because a subversion of your Parliament in Westminster took place. And the subversion was caused by Anthony Charles Lyndon Blair. Now, this man, solely and alone, is the man who took the decision to go to war, not his cabinet and not the Parliament. And this is the reason. As you well know, the United Kingdom does not have a written constitution. You have parliamentary conventions going back centuries. And one of the powers vested in the highest office of Prime Minister is royal prerogative. And that simply means that if the Prime Minister puts a motion to the floor of the House of Commons and argues the motions, and it is carried by the numbers in the way he proposed it, it is his decision. The decision to go to war was Anthony Charles Lyndon Blair's, and the Chilcot inquiry video YouTube that I'll give you a link to shows that. The Chilcot inquirers asked him, when did you take the decision? And this man answered, because that was a question to him as executive power holder, when did you take this decision? Under royal prerogative, even if the motion that Anthony Charles Lyndon Blair argued in Westminster on the floor of the House of Commons, even if that motion had gone against him with the numbers, under royal prerogative, this man and any Prime Minister has the power to simply push it through under royal prerogative. And that's probably what he intended to do. It doesn't matter. The point to make is, this man put the motion forward, argued it, demanded it, constructed it, and built it. His cabinet and the Parliament are not guilty of taking the decision. It was his decision. All an executive power high office holder does when an act of war takes place, they are the commander-in-chief and they take a nation to war, such as when it was solemnly declared by the Second World War. It is the Prime Minister, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, taking the decision. Now, the Cabinet and the Parliament, all they do is ratify the decision-making power of the highest executive holder of the office of Prime Minister. They are simply giving the ratification to the power of that person to take the country to war. It is not the Cabinet that takes the country to war, and it is not the Parliament that takes the country to war. The decision is made by the Commander-in-Chief. Exactly the same in the Australian Parliament and the United States Congress, whereby those horrific words uttered by George Walker Bush were, "Upon my orders," the most dreadful words any human can make in war. So, what I urge you to do, citizens of the United Kingdom, my fellow sisters and brothers of the world, is when Chilcot reports and sends the report to Parliament, it is up to all Britons, as they mobilise for the recent referendum you had, to mobilise under your legal representatives in Parliament and force the most stringent reprisal action to be taken against Anthony Charles Linton Blair, because he must be charged by the Parliament with subversion of Parliament. Because no matter whether the weapons or not weapons at the time, the risk was gone after Iraq surrendered. So Anthony Charles Linton Blair put a charade of false arguments to the Parliament about weapons of mass destruction, and nobody in Parliament questioned Anthony Charles Linton Blair about the fact that Iraq had written a formal, authorised, written full surrender of its political system, its military armaments, its sovereignty and its territory. No one in Parliament spoke to that grave, solemn responsibility not to attack. And the same with Chilcot. I was acknowledged as having made a contribution to the Chilcot inquiry. And throughout the inquiry, I've been watching it closely, not one Chilcot inquirer asked Anthony Charles Linton Blair, why did you attack after Iraq issued a formal written surrender? All they did was ask a prepared summary of charade statements about the weapons of mass destruction. And that man merely answered, it was his view that there were weapons. It was his view that there were risks. What a person's view is immaterial. In law, and particularly in warfare and international law, in war, the facts are what you base a decision to go to war on. And the facts are, the nation of Iraq had formally, honourably surrendered, as the Japanese did. And horrifically and dreadfully, 6 months after that written surrender, Anthony Charles Linton Blair, John Winston Howard and George Walker Bush took the coalition of the Chilling to war and disgraced and shamed our nations. Also, I wish you to reflect upon the fact that all of the massive and monumental disruption from the streams of millions of displaced refugees to your shores was caused by the coalition of the Chilling's decision to attack after surrender. So were all of the brutal Islamic extremist acts all over the world, where there are mountains of dead, rivers and oceans of blood, and fields of broken hearts and broken families forever by this act of war taken after full surrender. So my fellow British citizens, thank you for watching this YouTube presentation. I have got this active brief of evidence against John Winston Howard for war crimes. I recommend you do the same. Select a prominent QC, barrister who is capable of taking an action under a jus in bello precedent doctrine precedent case, as I have done against John Winston Howard, because no one else has taken this action worldwide against any of these three leaders. And the United Kingdom and Australia are signatories to the International Criminal Court. The United States is not. You have the power to force Anthony Charles Lyndon Blair to fall for committing war crimes, as he has done. Then it's a natural consequence that Australia's ex-Prime Minister John Winston Howard, another recreant craven coward who has bombed after surrender, will fall. And then there will be world pressure for George Walker Bush to fall. All of the instability, including the Brexit vote and the European turmoil and the heartbreaking tragedy of displaced refugees worldwide, is all caused by these three rogue, butchering, heinous killers for attacking after a nation surrendered. So please, watch Chilcot, watch the result, take massive combined concerted action with your fellow citizens to pressure your parliamentarians to charge Anthony Charles Lyndon Blair with subversion of Parliament, which is what he has done. That produces sufficient evidence for there to be a brief of evidence and charges of war crimes against Anthony Charles Lyndon Blair, as I have taken against John Winston Howard in Australia. And it can be taken under the jus in bello doctrine precedent, whereby it is an extreme disproportionate attack to wage war on the four cities I've named, such as Najaf, Fallujah, Basra and Baghdad, cities bigger than Melbourne, Australia. It is an extreme act of war crimes to attack those cities at night after the nation of Iraq had surrendered. So no one else has taken this action against your Prime Minister. The action is open to you. I recommend that your citizenry organise, find a Queen's Counsel barrister able to take the case, as I have done. I'll give you links on this YouTube to the case that I've been forwarding to the International Criminal Court over the years. And I wish you well, because we now have the power to make an abrupt stop and halt to the heinous killing of and deaths from Iraq and other disrupted nations, and from deaths from disrupted societies through displaced refugees worldwide. And we have the ability and power to change the world forever. Thank you. I wish you to know that I produced a business card of John Winston Howard in 2003, and I've been carrying it in my compendium daily since 2003. I wish to show you the business card of John Winston Howard. This is the picture of Ali Ismail Abbas, whose 17 members of his family were killed. His arms were blown off at age 12 in the Iraq War. This young boy, who's a man now, is a victim, and one of the key brief of evidence exhibits I made to my case to the International Criminal Court. And I wish you to see John Winston Howard's business card. Thank you.